Let me invite our guest to the show. We have founder of the Uhuru Movement, Omali Yeshitela from St. Petersburg, Florida, and also from Pan-African Community Action, we have Netfa Freeman joining us out of Washington, D.C. Good to have both of you on the show. Now let's go to Omali first. George Floyd's death has apparently opened old wounds of similar incidents happening in not so distant past. It may not be the last such case either. So what's become of the U.S.?
I don't think we're looking at something that's become of the U.S. I think we're looking at the history of a relationship that African people have with the United States government. You must remember that African people came to this country at gunpoint, that we have existed as colonial subjects since our coming here. And you must also remember that the United States itself is a settler state that exists on land of the traditional people who are in concentration camps today called Indian reservations. So it's nothing new. And the fact is that you can keep a colonial people, a people under colonial domination, only through the constant use of most extreme forms of violence. And that's what we see in this instance, but that's what we've seen all the time. This is not a new phenomenon at all.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Netfa, you know, the 4 cops involved in this latest death have been fired. Is that enough? President Trump's tweet has promised justice will be served. Will it?
Well, I mean, I'd have to agree with my brother O'Malley because we can't expect the state that enforces the neo-settler colonial paradigm against us to bring justice. And this is only one case. I mean, there certainly will be more, and there's certainly others. So the question is not really only about them being brought to justice, because that could happen and might maybe not happen all the time. A lot of times they don't bring these people to justice, meaning arresting them for murder, that has to be it. It can't just be that they're fired. But the real thing is about decolonization. I mean, we have to say that we're dealing with a colonial relationship that has to insist on controlling their subjects through violence, and the only way for us to find self-determination and liberation is through, at least maybe at the beginning of the process, community control over the police, where we are not being repressed by occupation forces whose job is to make sure that we remain oppressed and that we're obedient and that we're in line, and that they also, when it comes to us being an expendable population in this time of neoliberal capitalism, where there's extra people, more people than the system can sustain, the capitalist system can sustain, then they have to employ things like mass incarceration and extrajudicial killings, even if we're not doing anything that's turned out of control. So we have to have campaigns that fight for our self-determination and power, our ability to implement things and policies and procedures and then protect the outcome. That's what power is. And so not even is charging them with murder enough, but we have to actually have a process and a program for liberation.
Now, Omali, Washington has oftentimes pushed for the observance of human rights in other countries and has at times even taken action against them. But on the home front, this is how it's treating its own people. Your comment.
Well, first of all, I think the point that's being made is that we are not its own people, that we are subject and colonized people, first of all, and that how America preems are traveling around the world characterizing itself as being for human rights, etc., is something that is obviously at odds with the treatment of Africans and other colonial subjects, including the indigenous people on whose land this settler colony rests and who never get spoken of, and who live in concentration camps that are euphemistically referred to as Indian reservations. That's one aspect of it. But even when the United States goes around the world placing sanctions and attacking other countries and peoples because of their alleged opposition to human rights, that is to say the countries and people who are being sanctioned, they claim that these people are violating some kind of human rights, and that's the basis for it. It is a political basis and economic basis that motivates the United States government, and that this idea about human rights, they never fought for human rights. The United States is incapable, absolutely, totally incapable of fighting for human rights. And I just want to go back to this whole question of the United States being a settler colony. It was founded on genocide, on the genocide of indigenous people, on the enslavement of African people. It does not have the ability. And when you talk about justice, this country can't give justice, no matter what they do to the 4 cops who they unleashed on the African community. They can't find justice. And we have to fight for colonial control. We have to fight for control of our own lives. And this is something that the colonized have to do. It's not something that the American state, the American government is going to confer on us. We're going to have to take it. In fact, our organization is involved right now all the time in waging a struggle and organizing for the capacity to be self-governing in this country and throughout the world where African people exist and are oppressed because by a social system that founded itself on the enslavement of black people here and around the world and the genocide. So it's up to us, and that's what we're working for, to take power. We cannot even imagine ending this without having power in our own hands. That's our responsibility. That's what we're organizing for.
Interesting. Now, Netfa, given President Trump's attitude toward minorities in the U.S., and you know what I mean, so what kind of a situation do you expect for African Americans living in the States?
Well, it's a situation we're in now. It wasn't even that long ago, at the end of last year in December, that the Trump administration called for Operation Relentless Pursuit. This is just another one of the operations that's increasing the militarization and the police repression against our communities here. And so right now, because of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're using and we're seeing over-policing and well, not over-policing, but policing us and controlling us, and using the social distancing or the non-compliance with it as an excuse to over-police us. And we can see the racism involved in that, where in places like New York or other places where there'll be crowds of white people, and that the police will be maybe encouraging them to social distance and handing them even face masks. But in our communities, they jam us up and they beat us down, and they'll even kill people. And so it's really more of the same. It's not something new. And it wasn't also. It was during the pandemic that some of the what do you call them? I guess strategic planners from the military and the police and who are also happen to be fellows of the Brookings Institute were talking about the fact that the United States need to be prepared to use the military, the National Guard, to help supplement the police in our communities, expecting civil unrest. At the beginning of this, before the beginning of this report, you had a report talking about the astronomical numbers of unemployed people in the United States because of this capitalist system unable to deal with the healthcare situation and also the need for people to be able to fight the pandemic and still sustain their living. Disproportionate numbers of those people will be black and brown people, working class people, particularly women, who are disproportionately affected by that situation. And as our people become to respond, because people are talking about what's happening in the different cities like Minnesota and what happened with Brother George Floyd, the response to it and the rebellions, because we don't use this term riots, we're rebelling, the response to it as only about this one incident. But these, they've done, we know there's not about one incident. It's the sum total of the injustices that we face in this settler colonial situation, and we can only expect more of the same. Like Brother O'Malley's saying, we have to fight for power. We can't expect this, and they'll become more repressive, because as the system feels that it's losing control, as it feels that we may be even seeing it more clearly, then they'll use this situation to level even more repression against us.
Now, O'Malley, Netfa spoke about this pandemic that's also plaguing the U.S., among other countries as well. But the U.S. is number one, unfortunately, as you know. So on top of such violence against people of color in the U.S., they also, the African Americans also constitute the bulk of COVID-19 fatalities. Why?
We refer to this as the colonial virus because the virus is a part of the war that's constantly and perpetually being made against African people. The police simply function as a colonial military occupation force in African communities. That's why you see the kinds of outcomes that you're looking at that distinguishes what happens to African people in this country, what happens to Mexicans in this country from what happens to the white colonial settlers, because the police function as a military occupying force, and the colonial virus that on average is responsible for something like 2.5 times more deaths of African people. That's responsible in places like Louisiana, something like maybe more than 70% of deaths of African people. Chicago, similar numbers, and in St. Louis, up until recently, up until a few days ago, 100% of the people who died of coronavirus were African people. And now I think there might be 3 or 4 white people who have died because of that. It's a colonial virus, and it's a virus that it's not a medical problem, because if it were a medical problem, it would be affecting everybody across the board in the same way. It's affecting African people a certain way because Africans do not have power over our lives, and the colonial domination, colonialism means the economic and political domination of a people by a foreign and hostile alien force. And that's what happens to African people in this country. So there's no justice. And even when we look at what we're talking about, the virus and how it affects African people, we're looking at another form of colonial weaponry that's being utilized against our people. This is one of the reasons that African people are extremely upset. Africans all around this country understand that it's we who are dying of this virus, and that the reason that we are dying of this virus is because the colonizer has control over our lives. It determines whether or not there's going to be a hospital. It determines whether or not there's going to be anything like masks. It determines whether there are going to be any kind of resources that speak to the health of the African population, whether or not we have jobs, etc. We are called the essential workers, essentially because we do all the dirty work in this country. We are in those places where violence is concentrated in terms of homelessness, in terms of people not being able to have jobs and things like that, and that's determined by a colonial power that has violently assumed control of our lives. We're talking about a whole social system that people refer to as capitalism that has its origin in slavery and colonialism, and the war initiated against Africa that has dispersed the African nation throughout the world at gunpoint. So it's a colonial virus. It's colonial terror that we are affected by, and that the thing that makes it different for people, difficult sometimes for people to understand it, it is a domestic colony. It is a colonialism that happens on the same territory that's occupied by the colonizer, where most people recognize if the Americans were in Vietnam, they were colonial invaders. If the Americans were in Afghanistan, they were colonial invaders. But here, the Americans are places where the colonizers exist too, and so they trick people, they confuse people, they do as the French used to do, and to say that we are all Americans. The French used to do the same thing in Algeria. They wouldn't recognize the struggle against French domination because they said that France was just one of the provinces, Algeria was a province of France, and they treat African people in the same way, and it confuses a lot of people because we live in the same territory. But colonialism is something that's recognizable because it attacks people who are not European. It attacks black people who are the foundation of the founding of the colonial capitalist system in this country. It attacks the Mexican people who have been displaced because half of Mexico was stolen at gunpoint, affecting both Mexico, the territory proper, and the occupied Mexico, such as California, Texas, Utah, Colorado, and other places inside this country. And it attacks the indigenous people, people who obviously do not look white, are attacked a certain way. They call it racism, but the fact is it's the way colonialism articulates itself in this country, which is a domestic colony, and that's what we're up against.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, Netfa, let's look at it a bit more deeply. You know, some observers believe that racial profiling and hate crimes have been institutionalized in the U.S. Could you cite some underlying factors that have contributed to this?
I think we've been talking about the underlying factors. I think
number
because
of them were just mentioned.
So I mean, basically, the colonial situation is a racialized situation. So the capitalism in the United States is racialized. Even the origins of the police go back to the slave patrols trying to recapture and escaped enslaved people and put down rebellions and those type of things. And so it's really never changed. And then it's also coupled with the capitalists having to protect capitalism. The second tier of a formation, predecessors of the police, were the private security agencies that the capitalists hired to protect their property against the worker rebellions and unions. And so over time, and because of the race situation, the racism in the United States, the inherent racism that makes up this country, the racial profiling is a product of having to keep in control those people who are not meant to benefit from the capitalist system. And so it's not really a new thing, and a lot of times the media will talk about things that are new because they can't afford to let us know the inherent features, the features of the system that are inherent, that are characteristic of it.